Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now, let's step inside. Why ADX Florence makes inmates lose the ability to think clearly. Most people believe the mind is strongest when the body is restrained, that if someone is locked away long enough, their thoughts will sharpen, their focus will increase, and their awareness will remain intact. But inside ADX Florence, the opposite slowly unfolds. This is not a place where the mind is challenged. It is a place where the mind is starved. At first, inmates think clearly. They analyze their surroundings. They memorize routines. They plan. They reflect. They believe their intelligence will protect them, that thinking is something no prison can take away. But ADX Florence is not designed to attack intelligence directly. It is designed to make thinking unnecessary. Day after day, decisions disappear. Problems vanish. Conversations end before they begin. There are no debates, no negotiations, no complex choices. The environment becomes so controlled that the brain no longer needs to reason deeply to survive. And the brain adapts, not by becoming stronger, but by becoming quieter. Over time, the ability to process information slows. Thoughts take longer to form. Simple decisions feel heavy. Concentration fades faster. The mind begins operating in short, shallow loops instead of deep, flexible patterns. This change does not feel dramatic. It feels like mental fatigue, like fog, like effort without reward. In ADX Florence, overthinking serves no purpose. Creativity goes unused. Problem-solving has no outlet. The brain learns that clarity is optional and depth is inefficient. What remains is a mental state optimized for endurance, not intelligence. This documentary explores what happens when a human mind is left without stimulation, challenge, or meaningful interaction for years. How thinking speed declines quietly. Why memory becomes harder to access. And why some inmates struggle to follow normal conversations long after release. Because the most dangerous thing ADX Florence does is not silence thoughts. It makes the brain forget how to use them. When thinking is no longer required. In the outside world, thinking is constantly exercised. Every day demands decisions, problem-solving, judgment, and adaptation. Conversations require listening and responding. Work requires planning. Social life requires reading signals and adjusting behavior. The human brain stays sharp not because it wants to, but because it must. Inside ADX Florence, that requirement slowly disappears. At first, inmates arrive mentally alert. Their minds are active, scanning the environment, assessing routines, and learning rules. They observe patterns, predict schedules, and think through possibilities. This initial phase creates a powerful illusion, the belief that intelligence alone is enough to endure confinement. And for a short time, it is. The brain is excellent at adapting to new environments. During the early months, inmates use reasoning to stay oriented. They mentally map the day. They rehearse conversations internally. They analyze their situation. Thinking becomes a tool for control, a way to feel less powerless. But ADX Florence does not challenge the mind. It removes a need for it. Once routines are learned, there is little left to solve. Schedules do not change. Rules are fixed. Interactions are minimal and scripted. Choices are nearly non-existent. The environment becomes predictable to the point where thinking ahead provides no advantage, and the brain notices. Human cognition is energy-intensive. Deep thinking, creativity, and problem-solving require effort. When those functions no longer serve a purpose, the brain begins to scale them back, not as a failure, but as efficiency. This is the first stage of cognitive decline, underuse. Inside ADX Florence, there is nothing to negotiate, no problems to reason through, no social complexity to interpret. Over time, the brain stops initiating deep thought because there is no payoff. Thinking becomes optional, then unnecessary. At first, this feels like rest. Inmates may describe feeling calmer, less mentally stressed, less pressured. Without constant demands, the mind feels quieter. But this quiet is deceptive. It is not recovery. It is disengagement. As weeks turn into months, The brain begins operating in shorter cognitive loops. Instead of sustained attention, thinking becomes brief and functional. Instead of complex reasoning, the mind defaults to simple recognition patterns. Wake, wait, eat, sleep. Anything beyond that feels excessive. This shift does not cause immediate distress. In fact, many inmates believe they are coping well. They feel mentally stable. They are not overwhelmed. But subtle changes are already occurring. Concentration weakens. Reading becomes harder to sustain. Focus drifts more easily. Tasks that once required little effort now demand deliberate attention. The brain struggles to stay engaged because it has not been trained to do so anymore. This is not laziness. It is neural adaptation. The brain strengthens the pathways it uses and weakens those it does not. In ADX Florence, deep thinking pathways receive little reinforcement. Over time, they atrophy from neglect. Another critical factor is lack of feedback. Outside prison, thinking is shaped by response. Ideas are tested through conversation. Mistakes are corrected. Thoughts evolve through interaction. Inside ADX Florence, feedback disappears. Thoughts remain internal, unchallenged, and repetitive. Without correction or stimulation, thinking becomes stagnant. The mind begins recycling the same ideas rather than generating new ones. Creativity fades not because it is suppressed, but because it has nowhere to go. Problem-solving loses relevance. The brain shifts from exploration to maintenance. This maintenance mode is dangerous because it feels normal. Inmates may still feel capable. They still understand language. They still remember facts. But their ability to process complexity declines. Abstract thinking becomes tiring. Multi-step reasoning feels slow. Decision-making changes as well. When choices are rare, the brain loses practice making them. Over time, even small decisions feel mentally heavy. The mind hesitates, not from fear, but from unfamiliarity. Thinking through options feels like unnecessary effort. This is how mental fog begins. Not as confusion, but as resistance to cognitive effort. Another subtle shift occurs in language processing. Without conversation, the brain loses fluency in spontaneous speech. Internal thoughts become simpler, less nuanced. Vocabulary shrinks from disuse. The mind relies on basic constructs instead of layered expression. This does not mean intelligence is gone. It means access to it is reduced. The inmate still has knowledge, but retrieving and applying becomes harder. Thinking takes longer. Mental agility declines. The brain becomes slower to respond, slower to adapt, slower to analyze. This is especially noticeable during unexpected moments. When routines are disrupted, the mind struggles to adjust. Flexibility has weakened. Cognitive rigidity sets in, and all of this happens without alarm. There is no pain signal for underused cognition. The brain does not warn you when thinking capacity is declining. It simply adapts to the environment it is given. ADX Florence creates an environment where thinking deeply is unnecessary for survival. Over time, the brain aligns with that reality. It conserves energy. It simplifies processes. It becomes efficient but limited. This is why intelligence alone does not protect inmates. In fact, intelligence can make the process more deceptive. Smart individuals often adapt quickly, learning routines faster, and settling into predictability sooner. That efficiency accelerates cognitive disengagement rather than preventing it. By the end of this phase, inmates are still mentally present. They are not confused. They are not detached from reality. But they are no longer mentally sharp in the way they once were. Thinking feels heavier. Clarity feels distant. Mental effort feels optional. This is only the beginning. In the next phase, this cognitive quiet deepens into something more disruptive, where mental fog becomes persistent and clarity becomes difficult to recover. How mental fog slowly replaces clarity. After the initial stage where thinking becomes optional, a deeper and more troubling shift begins to take hold. This is a phase where inmates no longer just think less. They begin to think through fog. Mental fog is difficult to describe because it doesn't feel like confusion. There is no panic, no obvious disorientation. Instead, it feels like moving through thoughts that are slightly out of reach. Ideas are there, but they arrive late. Focus exists, but it fades quickly. Clarity appears briefly, then slips away. Inside ADX Florence, this fog develops gradually as a direct result of prolonged cognitive underuse combined with extreme predictability. The brain, having learned that deep thinking offers no advantage, begins operating in a low engagement mode. Over time, this mode becomes a default. Inmates often notice this change during simple mental tasks. Reading a paragraph requires more effort than before. Retaining information becomes inconsistent. Thoughts drift mid-sentence. It becomes harder to hold multiple ideas in the mind at once. This is not memory loss in the clinical sense. It is reduced mental bandwidth. The brain is still capable of understanding, but it processes information more slowly and less efficiently. Tasks that once felt automatic now require deliberate effort. The mind tires faster, not because it is weak, but because it has adapted to a narrower cognitive environment. One of the key contributors to mental fog is lack of novelty. The human brain relies on new stimuli to stay alert. Novelty forces the brain to engage, compare, evaluate, and learn. Inside ADX Florence, novelty is almost completely absent. Days are nearly identical. Environments do not change. Interactions are minimal and scripted. Without novelty, the brain has little reason to remain fully engaged. This leads to reduced alertness and slower processing. The mind enters a semi-idle state, conserving energy by lowering attention and responsiveness. Over time, this state becomes permanent. Another contributor is absence of cognitive challenge. Outside prison, the brain is constantly tested. Conversations demand quick responses. Problems require creative solutions. Even small interactions exercise attention and reasoning. Inside ADX Florence, challenges are removed. There is nothing to argue, negotiate, or analyze. The brain deprived of challenge loses sharpness. This loss is subtle. Inmates do not suddenly feel unintelligent. Instead, they feel mentally tired more often. Concentration slips faster. Complex ideas feel overwhelming rather than stimulating. This is where mental fog becomes noticeable. The fog also affects working memory, the ability to hold and manipulate information temporarily. Inmates may struggle to keep track of steps in a thought process. Planning becomes harder. Multi-step reasoning feels burdensome. This is especially apparent during moments that require adjustment. When a routine changes slightly, the mind reacts slower. It takes longer to process what is happening and how to respond. The brain has become accustomed to predictability. Language processing is also affected. Without conversation, the brain loses fluency in real-time verbal construction. Thoughts become simpler. Internal dialogue shortens. Vocabulary becomes less accessible, not because words are forgotten, but because retrieval is slower. This creates a sense of mental dullness. Inmates may still understand complex ideas when presented slowly, but generating those ideas independently becomes difficult. The mind feels reactive rather than proactive. Another critical factor is lack of emotional stimulation. Emotion and cognition are closely linked. Emotional engagement sharpens attention and strengthens memory. Inside ADX Florence, emotional input is minimal. Without emotional variation, cognitive engagement weakens further. The brain begins treating most information as low priority. This reinforces the fog. Over time, inmates may describe feeling mentally heavy or sluggish. Not confused, just slower. It takes longer to feel mentally awake. It takes more effort to stay focused. The mind feels distant from the world around it. This state can persist for years. What makes mental fog particularly dangerous is that it does not trigger alarm. There is no clear signal that something is wrong. The brain adapts silently. Inmates adjust expectations. They stop demanding clarity from themselves. This normalization deepens the condition. Mental fog also affects self-confidence in thinking. When thoughts feel slow or unreliable, individuals may begin doubting their cognitive ability. This leads to hesitation, second-guessing, and avoidance of mental effort. Why think deeply if it feels exhausting? Why analyze if clarity is fleeting? The brain learns to avoid effort altogether. This avoidance reinforces the fog. By this stage, Inmates are no longer actively disengaging from thinking. They are unable to sustain it. Cognitive endurance has declined. The mind fatigues quickly. This is not permanent brain damage, but it is functional impairment. And the longer the brain operates in this reduced mode, the harder it becomes to return to full clarity. Mental fog also changes how inmates experience time. Days blend together more completely. Events fail to stand out. Memory encoding weakens because attention is inconsistent. Large stretches of time feel compressed when recalled. This creates a sense that years disappear without leaving clear mental traces. When inmates eventually face new environments or conversations, the fog becomes painfully apparent. Processing speed feels insufficient. Information overload occurs quickly. The brain struggles to keep up. This can lead to frustration and withdrawal. The mind, trained to function with minimal input, finds stimulation overwhelming. Instead of sharpening cognition, exposure complexity can deepen confusion and fatigue. This is why cognitive recovery after long-term isolation is not automatic. The brain must relearn how to engage deeply, sustain focus, and tolerate complexity. Without structured support, many individuals remain mentally foggy long after confinement ends. This chapter reveals a critical truth. Clarity is not a fixed trait. It is a function of environment, stimulation, and use. When those elements are removed for long periods, clarity fades, quietly, gradually, and dangerously. And in the next chapter, we will examine how this mental fog affects problem-solving and decision-making, further limiting the mind's ability to function in complex environments. When problem-solving and decision-making begin to collapse, by the time mental fog is settled in, another critical ability starts to weaken: problem-solving. This is not because inmates stop caring, and not because intelligence disappears. It happens because the brain has spent too long in an environment where problems rarely exist and decisions no longer matter. In ADX Florence, nearly everything is decided in advance. When to wake up, when to eat, when to move, when to stop. The inmate's role is not to decide, but to comply. Over time, the brain internalizes this structure, and the cognitive systems responsible for evaluating options begin to shut down from disuse. Problem-solving requires exposure to uncertainty. It requires consequences, choices, and feedback. Inside ADX Florence, uncertainty is minimized by design. The environment is rigid, predictable, and repetitive. There is no incentive to analyze outcomes, because outcomes are fixed regardless of effort. The brain adapts by simplifying its internal processes. At first, this feels like relief. Without constant decisions, mental pressure decreases. There is no need to weigh options or consider consequences. Life becomes mechanically straightforward. But what feels like simplicity is actually cognitive atrophy in disguise. Decision-making is a muscle. Without use, it weakens. Inmates begin to experience decision fatigue, even when the number of decisions is small. Choosing between minor options can feel overwhelming. The brain hesitates, stalls, or defaults automatically rather than evaluating possibilities. This hesitation is not fear. It is unfamiliarity. The mind has not practiced choosing. Over time, the brain learns that decision-making is unnecessary and even inefficient. When decisions are imposed externally for years, internal decision pathways weaken. The inmate becomes accustomed to waiting for instruction rather than initiating action. This has profound consequences. When unexpected situations arise, the mind struggles to respond. Cognitive flexibility declines. Instead of adapting, the brain freezes momentarily, searching for structure that no longer exists. Problem-solving becomes rigid. Rather than exploring multiple approaches, the brain defaults to the most familiar pattern. Creativity diminishes. Innovation feels mentally exhausting. The mind favors predictability over effectiveness. This shift is especially noticeable when routines are disrupted. A small change in schedule, a new instruction, or an unfamiliar task can feel disproportionately stressful. The brain struggles to reorient because it has lost practice adjusting. Another critical issue is reduced tolerance for ambiguity. Outside prison, ambiguity is constant. Conversations are nuanced. Situations are unclear. Decisions require interpretation. Inside ADX Florence, ambiguity is eliminated. Rules are explicit. Instructions are clear. There is little room for interpretation. Over time, the brain becomes uncomfortable with ambiguity. When faced with open-ended problems, the mind searches desperately for a correct answer rather than evaluating possibilities. This rigidity makes real-world decision-making extremely difficult. The inmate's thinking shifts from adaptive to rule-dependent. This also affects risk assessment. Normally, humans learn to evaluate risk by weighing potential outcomes. Inside ADX Florence, risk is minimized through strict control. There are few opportunities to practice judgment. As a result, the brain's ability to assess risk weakens. When freedom eventually returns, this can lead to two extremes: excessive caution or poor judgment due to lack of experience evaluating consequences. Neither is healthy. Another subtle but damaging effect is loss of initiative. Initiative requires confidence in one's ability to think and decide effectively. As decision-making slows and becomes effortful, confidence erodes. The inmate becomes hesitant to act without direction. This hesitation becomes self-reinforcing. The less initiative the brain takes, the less capable it feels. Over time, the mind associates action with discomfort and uncertainty, and passivity with safety. This is not laziness. It is learned dependency. The brain has learned that doing nothing is safer than choosing wrong. Problem-solving also depends heavily on working memory, the ability to hold information in mind while manipulating it. As mental fog reduces working memory capacity, problem-solving becomes harder. Multi-step reasoning feels overwhelming. Tasks that require planning several steps ahead become exhausting. The brain struggles to maintain focus long enough to complete complex reasoning. As a result, thinking becomes reactive rather than proactive. Instead of anticipating problems, the mind waits for them to happen. Instead of planning, it responds minimally. This further reduces cognitive engagement. Over time, the inmate's mental world shrinks. The brain becomes comfortable operating within narrow boundaries. Anything outside that boundary feels mentally taxing. The mind avoids complexity whenever possible. This avoidance has lasting consequences. When inmates eventually face real-world environments, decision-making demands explode. Choices are constant. Consequences are unclear. Social situations require rapid judgment. For a brain conditioned to minimal decision-making, this is overwhelming. Many individuals experience anxiety, confusion, or shut down in response, not because they are incapable, but because their cognitive systems have been underused for too long. This is why reintegration often fails without support. The brain must relearn how to think flexibly, evaluate options, and tolerate uncertainty. These skills do not automatically return with freedom. They require retraining. What makes this particularly tragic is that none of it feels dramatic while it's happening. There is no moment where an inmate realizes, "I can't solve problems anymore." Instead, the brain quietly lowers its expectations. Thinking less becomes normal. Choosing less becomes comfortable. And once the brain adapts to that level, climbing back up becomes difficult. This chapter exposes one of the most overlooked consequences of extreme confinement: the erosion of cognitive agency. When a person loses a habit of solving problems and making decisions, they lose more than mental sharpness. They lose autonomy of thought. And in the next chapter, we will examine how this loss of cognitive agency affects attention, comprehension, and the ability to follow normal conversations, pushing the mind even further into withdrawal. When attention and comprehension begin to fail, after prolonged mental fog and decision fatigue, another critical function begins to weaken: sustained attention. This is a stage where the mind no longer just thinks slowly, it struggles to stay engaged at all. Focus becomes fragile, comprehension becomes effortful, and normal conversation turns into a cognitive challenge. Attention is not a passive ability. It is an active process that must be exercised. In everyday life, attention is constantly trained through interaction, problem-solving, emotional engagement, and environmental variation. Inside ADX Florence, these demands disappear. The environment does not require attention. It demands obedience. At first, attention remains intact. Inmates can focus when necessary. They can read, listen, and follow instructions. But over time, the lack of mental stimulation changes how attention operates. Without novelty or challenge, the brain stops sustaining focus for long periods. Attention becomes short, shallow, and easily exhausted. This is not distraction. It is attention fatigue. The brain has learned that sustained focus is unnecessary. There is little to attend to. No dynamic conversation. No evolving tasks. No meaningful feedback. The mind adapts by lowering its attention threshold. This becomes evident in reading. Inmates may find themselves rereading the same lines repeatedly. Comprehension slips mid-paragraph. Focus breaks without warning. The brain drifts not because it is overwhelmed, but because it is underengaged. Attention without stimulation collapses inward. Another major factor is the absence of conversational rhythm. Conversation trains attention by forcing rapid shifts between listening, processing, and responding. Inside ADX Florence, conversations are minimal, short, and scripted. There is no back-and-forth flow to maintain cognitive engagement. Over time, the brain loses fluency in real-time processing. This becomes painfully clear when inmates are exposed to normal speech patterns. Conversations move too fast. Ideas overlap. Responses are expected quickly. For a mind trained in silence, this is overwhelming. Comprehension lags behind input. Words are heard, but meaning arrives late. By the time the brain processes one sentence, the conversation has moved on. This delay creates confusion and anxiety, even in simple exchanges. This is not hearing loss. It is processing delay. The brain's ability to decode, interpret, and respond has slowed. This delay is worsened by weakened working memory. Following a conversation requires holding multiple pieces of information in mind simultaneously. As working memory capacity declines, comprehension suffers. The brain drops information before it can be integrated. This leads to partial understanding. Inmates may catch fragments of conversation, but miss context. They may nod or respond inappropriately, not because they're inattentive, but because their minds cannot keep up. This experience can be deeply unsettling. Many individuals report feeling mentally left behind during conversations. They feel present but disconnected. This often leads to withdrawal, as avoiding conversation feels safer than struggling through it. Attention collapse also affects learning ability. New information becomes harder to absorb. Instructions must be repeated. Concepts take longer to grasp. The brain resists sustained effort because it has been conditioned to operate in low-demand environments. This creates a vicious cycle. The harder it becomes to focus, the more the brain avoids focus. The less it practices attention, the weaker attention becomes. Another overlooked aspect is sensory narrowing. Inside ADX Florence, sensory input is limited and predictable. The brain becomes accustomed to processing minimal stimuli. When exposed to complex environments, attention scatters. The mind cannot prioritize information effectively. Everything competes for attention, and the brain shuts down rather than sorting through it. This is why normal environments can feel exhausting. Attention collapse also impacts emotional understanding. Comprehending emotion requires attention to tone, facial expression, and context. When attention is weak, emotional signals are missed or misinterpreted. This can lead to social misunderstandings. The inmate may appear emotionally distant or unresponsive, not because they lack emotion, but because their attention cannot track emotional nuance in real time. Over time, this erodes confidence in social interaction. The individual may stop engaging, not out of disinterest, but out of fear of misunderstanding. Withdrawal becomes a coping strategy. Another consequence is reduced mental endurance. Sustaining attention requires energy. As attention weakens, mental fatigue sets in quickly. Even short interactions feel draining. The mind seeks relief through silence and inactivity. This reinforces isolation. The brain learns that disengagement feels better than struggle. Importantly, this is not a permanent loss of intelligence. It is a functional impairment caused by long-term environmental deprivation. The brain has adapted to conditions that do not require sustained attention, but adaptation has consequences. When the brain is later required to engage deeply, it resists. Focus feels uncomfortable. Comprehension feels slow. Conversations feel overwhelming. This stage marks a critical turning point. The inmate is no longer just thinking less clearly. They are struggling to stay mentally present. Attention slips away. Understanding fragments. Engagement fades. This makes reintegration into complex environments especially difficult. Work, education, and relationships all demand sustained attention and comprehension. Without retraining, the brain remains stuck in a low engagement mode. The tragedy is that this collapse happens silently. There is no alarm, no dramatic moment. The mind simply lowers its capacity and adjusts expectations. By the time attention failure becomes obvious, it has already been reinforced for years. And in the final chapter, we will examine the last stage of this cognitive decline, when mental effort itself becomes something the brain actively avoids and clarity feels permanently out of reach. When the mind begins avoiding effort altogether, by the time attention and comprehension have weakened, the most profound shift is no longer about what the mind can't do. It's about what the mind no longer wants to do. This is a final stage of cognitive decline inside ADX Florence, the point where mental effort itself becomes uncomfortable, even undesirable. At this stage, the brain has adapted fully to an environment that demands almost nothing from it cognitively. There are no complex conversations, no dynamic problems, no meaningful challenges. The mind has learned a simple rule: effort does not improve outcomes. And once that rule is internalized, motivation for thinking quietly disappears. This is not laziness. It is conditioning. The human brain is designed to balance effort against reward. When effort consistently produces no benefit, the brain reduces investment. Inside ADX Florence, deep thinking brings no advantage. Whether an inmate thinks hard or not, the day unfolds the same way. Over time, the brain stops offering energy for tasks that feel pointless. Mental effort becomes associated with discomfort rather than progress. At first, this avoidance is subtle. The inmate may still think deeply on occasion, but it feels draining. Concentration requires force. The mind tires quickly. Eventually, the brain begins steering away from effort automatically, choosing mental quiet over engagement. This creates a state of cognitive withdrawal. Thoughts become brief. Reflection is shallow. The mind stays close to the surface, avoiding complexity. Even internal questioning, once a source of stimulation, fades. The brain prefers stillness. This is where clarity becomes difficult to access. Clarity requires sustained engagement. It requires holding ideas, comparing them, testing them, and refining them. A brain that avoids effort cannot sustain this process. Thoughts arrive fragmented and incomplete. Understanding feels partial. Mental sharpness feels out of reach. Importantly, this does not feel alarming to the person experiencing it. By this stage, expectations have changed. The inmate no longer expects to think clearly. Fog feels normal. Mental dullness feels familiar. The brain adjusts its definition of functioning downward. This adjustment is protective. By lowering expectations, the brain reduces frustration. It shields itself from the discomfort of recognizing loss. But this protection comes at a cost. Recovery becomes harder. Another consequence of effort avoidance is loss of curiosity. Curiosity requires mental energy. It requires interest in the unknown. Inside ADX Florence, the unknown disappears. Everything is predictable. Over time, curiosity withers from neglect. The brain stops asking questions. Without curiosity, learning slows dramatically. New information feels burdensome rather than intriguing. The mind resists complexity, preferring simplicity even when simplicity limits understanding. This affects self-perception. Individuals may begin to describe themselves as not very sharp anymore or slow, internalizing cognitive decline as personal failure rather than environmental adaptation. This belief further reduces effort, reinforcing the cycle. The avoidance of mental effort also affects emotional processing. Understanding emotions, one's own or others, requires reflection. When the brain avoids effort, emotional insight weakens. Feelings are experienced but not examined. Emotional awareness becomes shallow. This contributes to emotional detachment. Not because emotion is gone, but because the mind avoids engaging with it deeply. Another key aspect of this stage is mental endurance collapse. Even when clarity briefly appears, it cannot be sustained. The brain fatigues quickly, focus fades, the effort feels unsustainable. This creates a painful contradiction. The person knows clarity exists but cannot hold on to it. This can be deeply discouraging. Over time, the brain learns to stop trying. The most dangerous aspect of this stage is what happens after release. When individuals re-enter environments that demand thinking, learning, and decision-making, the gap becomes painfully obvious. Tasks that require sustained attention feel overwhelming. Reading long documents is exhausting. Conversations feel mentally taxing. Planning feels confusing. The brain responds by retreating. Instead of engaging, it withdraws. Instead of thinking, it avoids. Instead of adapting, it seeks simplicity and routine. This is why some former inmates struggle to function in open environments despite being intelligent and capable. Their brains have learned to conserve energy by avoiding effort, and that habit does not disappear automatically. Recovery requires retraining. The brain must be slowly reintroduced to challenge, stimulation, and effort. Cognitive endurance must be rebuilt gradually. Without this process, mental avoidance can persist for years. This chapter exposes the final truth of cognitive decline inside ADX Florence. The loss is not just ability, but willingness. When the brain learns that thinking is unnecessary, it stops offering clarity voluntarily. And once effort is avoided long enough, clarity feels foreign. This is why the effects of extreme confinement are so difficult to reverse. The brain has not been damaged. It has been optimized for a world that no longer exists. In the end, the most lasting impact is not confusion or forgetfulness. It is a quiet decision the brain makes every day. Thinking is not worth the cost, and undoing that decision requires time, patience, and an environment that once again makes thinking meaningful. By the time a person has spent years inside ADX Florence, the most profound damage is not something you can see. There are no visible wounds, no obvious signs of collapse. What changes instead is a relationship between the mind and effort. This documentary has shown that the loss of clear thinking inside extreme confinement does not happen suddenly. It happens quietly through adaptation. The brain is not attacked. It is neglected, deprived of challenge, conversation, choice, and stimulation. It slowly learns that thinking deeply is unnecessary. Over time, clarity becomes optional. Effort becomes uncomfortable, and cognitive sharpness fades from daily life. What makes this transformation so dangerous is how natural it feels. The mind is doing what it was designed to do: conserve energy, adapt to its environment, and survive. Inside ADX Florence, survival does not require intelligence, creativity, or problem solving. It requires stability. And so the brain reorganizes itself around that goal. This is not a failure of will. It is not a lack of intelligence. It is not weakness. It is adaptation. But adaptation always comes with a cost. When thinking is no longer practiced, it weakens. When decision-making disappears, initiative fades. When attention is underused, comprehension slows. And when mental effort stops feeling useful, the mind begins to avoid it altogether. The tragedy is that these changes do not automatically reverse with freedom. Once the brain has learned to function in a low-demand environment, it does not instantly recalibrate when that environment changes. Clarity must be rebuilt. Focus must be retrained. Cognitive endurance must be restored step by step. This is why release from extreme confinement can be disorienting rather than liberating. The world outside demands constant thought, choice, and adaptation. For a brain conditioned to silence and routine, that demand can feel overwhelming. ADX Florence is often discussed as a place of physical security and control, but its most lasting impact is psychological. It teaches the brain a lesson that lingers long after the cell door opens, that thinking deeply is optional and effort is risky. Understanding this is not about sympathy or judgment. It is about awareness. Because the mechanisms explored here, mental disengagement, cognitive underuse, effort avoidance, are not exclusive to prisons. They reveal something fundamental about the human mind. We become what our environment asks us to be. When environments demand thought, the mind sharpens. When environments demand nothing, the mind withdraws. The story of ADX Florence is an extreme example of this truth. It shows us how powerful environmental influence can be, and how easily clarity can fade when the mind is left without reason to engage. In the end, the most dangerous effect of extreme confinement is not what it takes away immediately, but what it teaches the brain to stop doing over time. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.